All right, good afternoon. We're going to go back a long time.
Joe, I said that I can hear and see.
Right here.
112 years ago. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been here before. And why go back 112 years? Well, this guy is elected president, Woodrow Wilson. And you probably heard about this thing, the Titanic sinking. How many of you seen the movie, The Titanic Sinking? How many of you been on cruise ships? Nobody? I'm the only one? Oh yes, I'm the only one who's ever spoken on cruise ships. And one topic that you were not allowed to talk about for a very long time on cruise ships was the Titanic. The prelude to World War I, the Balkan War, 1912. How many of you have been to Arizona or New Mexico? Anybody been to Arizona or New Mexico? Well, they became states in 1912. They became the 47th and 48th states of the Union. Movie censorship and racism. Do you know that movies were censored back in 1912, 1913, 1914? Know anything about it? There were movies, and the movies that were censored were by local movie boards. And Jack Johnson was the world heavyweight champion, and they were out to bring him down, and they did. Al Jolson, ever hear of Al Jolson? You ain't seen nothing yet, which you haven't seen anything yet. He becomes a superstar in 1912. You remember Jolie? And the first blues song was by W.C. Handy in 1912. Jim Thorpe wins a gold medal at the Olympics. And the Olympics will be starting in Paris on July 26th. So this is kind of timely about Jim Thorpe as well and his adventures or misadventures in the Olympics. How many of you like Tarzan?
Henry.
How many of you like Tarzan? The book comes out. And how many of you like the Oreo cookie? How many of you like the Oreo cookie? Just you? That's it? Nobody else is admitting that they like an Oreo cookie? Anybody want Oreo cookies right now? Well, the Oreo cookie made its debut in March of 1912 and has been selling ever since. And how many of you were Girl Scouts or had your kids being Girl Scouts? Well, the Girl Scouts of America start in 1912. But the big story of the year was Woodrow Wilson and the presidential election of 1912. Now, it's gotten kind of interesting in the last 10 days or so with the 2024 election. Probably not as interesting as this election in 1912. And I'm not going to talk about 2024. I just bring that up as sort of a comparison to what was going on in 1912 because it hasn't gotten to this point yet in 2024. Woodrow Wilson's elected president. On November 5th, Woodrow Wilson was elected president of the United States. He was not a career politician. He had been the president of Princeton University, Princeton, New Jersey, between 1902 and his election as governor of New Jersey in 1910. Wilson was not a serious contender. The Democrats' presidential nominee should have been somebody else, a guy by the name of Champ Clark. He had become the Speaker of the House after the Democratic takeover of the body in the 1910 elections, and he appeared to be the front runner for the nomination. But three-time presidential loser William Jennings Bryan had enormous clout in the party, even though he lost in 1896, 1900, and 1908. And he threw his support to Woodrow Wilson at the last hour. And on the 46th ballot at the Democratic Convention in Baltimore. The Republicans, meanwhile, stop me if you've heard this the last couple of days, the Republicans are in disarray. Another party in disarray in 2024, but this one can be proved. Proven. The Republicans were in disarray. To the left is Theodore Roosevelt. To the right is President William Howard Taft, who virtually was Roosevelt's hand-picked successor in 1908 for the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is in total disarray. Theodore Roosevelt did not like William Howard Taft, not because anything personal, just didn't like his policies, made it known. Taft faced a relentless public and a split Republican Party. National progressivism was at a nearly at high tide, and a large group of Republican progressives, also called insurgents, sat in Congress. These Republicans, like a majority of Americans, demanded such things as reforms for tariffs or bring down the tariffs, because you raise the tariffs, well, who's going to pay? The consumer, the American consumer. An income tax, yeah, let's impose an income tax on people. Direct election of senators, yes, let people vote for their senators, not for somebody in the legislature to pick a senator. And even stricter railroad and corporate regulations. You got to remember, 1911, year before, Standard Oil was busted up, Esso, Mobil, and a whole bunch of others, and also American Tobacco Company was busted up because people felt that monopolies were not good for competition. Well, Theodore Roosevelt is going to throw his hat in the ring. That's Oyster Bay, by the way, his house in Oyster Bay. If you ever want to go there, it's a nice place to go. Anyway, Roosevelt's going to run. Along with other more progressive Republican leaders, Roosevelt has split with Taft over the Taft administration's policies, particularly in defense of business interests. After all, people wanted to bust up monopolies back in the day, and maintaining high tariffs on imported goods, and his failure to follow Roosevelt in terms of conserving land or making national forests, or places like the Grand Canyon, making them national monuments, and Taft wasn't doing that. The insurgents, the Republican insurgents, determined to prevent Taft's renomination. They had their leader in Teddy Roosevelt, who had become increasingly alienated from Taft, and who made a whirlwind campaign for the presidential nomination in the winter of 1912 and the spring of 1912. And it's on to Chicago and the convention, the Republican convention. Roosevelt swept the presidential primaries even in Taft's home state, but Taft and conservative Republicans controlled the powerful state organizations, so the primaries meant nothing, and the Republican National Committee. And when the Republicans gathered for their national convention in Chicago in June, it proved to be a bitter, divisive affair. Taft was nominated on the first ballot, and Vice President James S. Sherman was easily renominated. Convinced that the bosses had stolen the... Wait, have I heard this somewhere before? Somebody stealing political power? Convinced that the bosses had stolen the nomination from him, Roosevelt led his followers out of the Republican convention. We're gone. We're going to do something else. We're gone. And they did. They formed another party. It was called the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party, and Theodore Roosevelt was the head. He formed the Progressive Party and nicknamed it the Bull Moose Party after he lost the presidential nomination of the Republicans to William Howard Taft. Oh, the Bull Moose nickname originated when Roosevelt boasted that he felt as strong as a bull moose after missing out the Republican nomination in the Chicago Convention. You know, Teddy Roosevelt was almost assassinated. Actually, he was assassinated in a way. He was shot at. Do you know the story about that? This is profile and courage. Major profile and courage. Attempted assassination. Theodore Roosevelt is shot by a maniac operated on in Chicago hospital. This AM assassin's bullet, lodges in breast. Well, he still gives a speech. It's October 14th. Roosevelt climbed into an open-air automobile that would take him to one of his final speeches at the tail end of the long, grueling campaign. As the car made its way to the Milwaukee Auditorium, a shot suddenly rang out. It was fired from a revolver just a few feet away, and Roosevelt knew immediately he had been hit. Reaching into his coat, he felt the bullet in his side. After coughing into his hand several times, seeing no blood, he guessed the wound was not fatal. So if it's not fatal, what's he going to do? I'll give a talk. I'll give a speech. Why not? He's a real trooper. So what does he do? He gives a speech. Although the doctor told Roosevelt's driver to take him to the hospital, Roosevelt demanded to be taken to the auditorium to give his speech. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose, Roosevelt said to the crowd upon his arrival. He pulled the speech from his coat. The 50-page remarks had been pierced by a ragged bullet hole. That was the shirt he was wearing that day, from the back, the left side where the bullet went in. Roosevelt told the crowd accurately that the folded speech probably saved me from the bullet going into my heart. The bullet is in me now, so I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try. How long do you think he lasted? 90 minutes. 90 minutes. After being shot, he gave a speech, lasted 90 minutes. He went on and on and on. Well, I could understand that if somebody shot me and I didn't feel all that bad, I'd probably be speaking too. I mean, it's natural, I guess. Roosevelt was rushed to the hospital in Milwaukee. Then he was taken to Chicago's Mercy Hospital. Physicians monitored Roosevelt for several days and ultimately decided not to remove the bullet. A week after he was shot, Roosevelt was released from the hospital and back campaigning on October 30th. Both Taft and Wilson suspended their campaigns for the time being. This is a guy by the name of John Fleming Schrank, and he's the insane man. Well, they think he's insane, according to the Milwaukee Sentinel newspaper headline, "Insane Man Shoots Roosevelt." He was a German-American. He was a tavern owner from Bavaria, and he tried to kill Roosevelt. He was a wealthy man who claimed to have visions telling him that he had to stop Theodore Roosevelt from being elected to a third term as President of the United States. He didn't have that voice in his head. He saw somebody tell him that. He was captured after Roosevelt's shooting. On November the 25th, he was committed to the Northern Hospital for the Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. On December 16th, a letter from Theodore Roosevelt to journalist John St. Lo Scratchy. Roosevelt wrote that Schrank was not a madman, but he had a disordered brain, which most criminals and a great many non-criminals have. Roosevelt was into eugenics, by the way. Eugenics was including things like measuring cranium size to see whether or not those people would be real Americans. Well, there was also one other guy in this race. His name was Eugene V. Debs, and he was the Socialist Party candidate. In the years prior to World War I, the Socialist Party had grown in strength, electing 2 members of Congress, 70 mayors, and many state legislators and city councilmen. The issues. What were the issues of 1912? And it may surprise you, but the issues of 1912 may sound very, very familiar to you. Roosevelt and the Bull Moose movement stressed its progressive reform credentials, even backing women's suffrage and women's rights. For Taft, his single objective in the campaign just beat Teddy Roosevelt. The real contest was between Roosevelt and Wilson for the control of the progressive majority. Campaigning strenuously on a platform he called New Nationalism, Roosevelt demanded effective control of big business. Have we heard that somewhere, like in the last decade or so? Through a strong federal commission, radical tax reform, and a whole series of measures to put federal government squarely into the business of social and economic reform. And here's a cartoonist of those days, Roosevelt lecturing to Taft about what he's supposed to do, and Taft saying, "This is what I did." By contrast, Woodrow Wilson seemed conservative with a program he called New Freedom. He planned to destroy monopolies, to open the doors of economic opportunity to small businesses through a drastic tariff reduction, banking reform, and severe tightening of antitrust laws. Okay, here's the elephant in the room. All 3 of these guys are racists. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. But they need some black votes in the 3-way race. And Woodrow Wilson decides he's going after the black vote, And he's meeting with that guy there, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a leader from the NAACP. As the Democratic nominee, Wilson gathered the cautious support of many of the nation's influential and politically diverse black leadership. His new freedom platform promised fairness and equality, and it caught the attention of prominent African-American activists, including W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP and publisher of the Crisis magazine, and William Monroe Trotter, a prominent and vocal activist and publisher of the civil rights newspaper, The Guardian. Frustrated by Republican President Taft's failure to address widespread lynching. The President of the United States did not talk about widespread lynching, which was taking place in the South. Du Bois endorsed the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, in the presidential race in exchange for Wilson's promise to support black causes. Civil rights in the presidential campaign. Theodore Roosevelt's administration between 1901 and 1909 was not supportive of civil rights for blacks. Roosevelt believed blacks were intellectually inferior. And he began to increase the number of federal appointments to blacks and promised Southerners that he would appoint local federal officials that would not disrupt the accord between the North and South. In other words, if you're black, you're not getting a federal job, at least not from Teddy Roosevelt. Taft publicly endorsed the idea that blacks should not participate in politics and perpetuated the racist party line of his predecessor. Teddy Roosevelt's looked at as a great guy now. Closer look at the record might indicate something different. On April 3rd, 1911, Taft directed the U.S. Army to expel the 9th Cavalry, an all-black unit from San Antonio, Texas. Earlier that day, the president met with San Antonio U.S. Congressman John Gardner, who urged President Taft to expel the black cavalrymen from the entire state of Texas because their protest of segregated seating on city streetcars threatened local law and order. Well, there's Woodrow Wilson. You can understand why that guy is smiling on the left. Why is that guy smiling on the right? He lost the election. Well, William Howard Taft really didn't want to be president. He wanted to be a judge, which he eventually would become. But he was probably happy to be out of there. On election day, Wilson got 6 million votes. Roosevelt 4 million, and the incumbent Taft got 3 million. Wilson's election made him only the second Democrat to win the presidency since the Civil War, a victory gained with only 42% of the popular vote. If you took Roosevelt and Taft's vote together, and assuming that none of the Republicans would stray, Wilson would have had his clock clean. But Wilson had 2 opponents. Despite being outpolled by the combined total votes for Roosevelt and Taft, Wilson's victory in the Electoral College was overwhelming. 438 electoral votes, 88 for Roosevelt. Taft suffered a humiliating defeat with only 8 electoral votes. Wilson did win, but the deciding factor was not his appeal to the voters. The Taft-Roosevelt split caused the Republican voters to take sides, and they did. Wilson benefited from the split. Most American women could not vote in this election. Most American women. In California, they could. Utah, they could. Wyoming, they could. Montana, they could, and some other states. But the big states in the East, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, men only. That was it. Sure, you know the story of the sinking of the Titanic. Anybody in here who doesn't know the story of the sinking of the Titanic? Everybody in here knows about the Titanic. And it lives on to this day, 112 years later. Like I said, I was on a cruise ship, and I spoke on about 50 cruise ships over the years. And don't want to go now because there are too many illnesses out there. If you get sick in the middle of the ocean, it's not the greatest thing in the world. But anyway, there are a couple things that you used to not be able to talk about or sing about. One was the Titanic. Another piano bar guy was telling me one day he had a list of songs that he was not allowed to play including one from Duke Ellington called "I Don't Get Around Much Anymore." How many of you are familiar with "I Don't Get Around Much Anymore" or "Don't Get Around Much Anymore"? And the reason why was that there were too many elderly men and women who married a second guy because they lost their first guy in World War II. And that was a World War II song. And they were told it would bring sad memories, so why do you bring down the cruise ship and talk about that or sing about that? So it's the Titanic and songs like "Don't Get Around Much Anymore." Barry from Boston was the piano player who told me that. Anyway, the Titanic sinks. On April 10th, the RMS Titanic, one of the largest and most luxurious ocean liners ever built, departed Southampton in England, port still in Southampton, on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic was designed by the Irish shipbuilder William Peary and built in Belfast, and was thought to be the world's fastest ship. It spanned 883 feet from its stern to its bow. Ships today are like city blocks long. And its hull was divided into 16... Leave that there. No, leave that. No, okay. I need this. You need that? Hold on one second. Okay, go ahead. Go. Okay, thanks. Hold on one second here. Okay, so anyway, because these components could be flooded without causing a critical loss of buoyancy, the Titanic was considered unsinkable. Ain't gonna sink, not gonna sink. On its first journey across the highly competitive Atlantic ferry route, that's what they called it, ferry route from England to New York, the ships carried 2,200 passengers and crew. Well, one of the first stops was here at Cherbourg, France, and everything looked okay, except when they left Southampton, they almost got into a collision. After stopping at Cherbourg and then Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up some final passengers, they are ready to go to New York. Just before midnight, April 14th, the RMS Titanic failed to divert its course and hit an iceberg. The collision ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. These are icebergs. This is Greenland. And in Greenland, you go around and you go through an area and you see lots and lots and lots of icebergs. That's a small iceberg. But it's still, you're able to pick it up. The compartments filled with water pulled down the bow of the ship. The compartments were not capped at the top, which meant water from the ruptured components filled each succeeding compartment, causing the bow to sink and the stern to be raised up to an almost vertical position over water. The Titanic broke in half at about 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. The stern and bow sank to the ocean floor. That was supposed to be the greatest ship, the absolute greatest ship that was ever built, the Titanic. In the early 1900s, the transatlantic passenger trade was highly profitable and competitive. Immigrants would get on these ships and they would head to New York, or some to Boston, or some to Halifax, Nova Scotia, or some to St. John in New Brunswick. The ships vying to transport wealthy travelers and immigrants. 2 of the chief lines, White Star and the Cunard, which is still around. By the summer of 1907, the Cunard seemed poised to increase its share of the market with the debut of 2 new ships, Lusitania and the Mauretania, which were both scheduled to enter service later that year. That is the Lusitania, New York, west side of New York, September of 1907. The 2 passenger liners were gathering much attention for their speed. Both would later set speed records crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Looking to answer his rival, the White Star chairman J. Bruce Ismay reportedly met with Peary, and who controlled the Belfast shipping building firm, Harland and Wolff, and they constructed most of the White Star vessels. The 2 men devised a plan to build a class of large liners that would be known for comfort instead of their speed. sort of like today with these huge 5,000 passenger cruise ships. By the way, I've been on those 5,000 passenger cruise ships. It's like going through Times Square on the water. Anyway, it eventually decided that 3 vessels would be constructed: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. On March 31st, 1909, so 3 months after work began on the Olympic, the keel was laid for the Titanic. In addition to ornate decorations, the Titanic featured an immense first-class dining saloon, 4 elevators, and a swimming pool. Its second-class accommodations were comparable to first-class features on other ships, and third class, which is where the immigrants went on all these ships, they were down at the bottom. Although modest, was still noted for their relative comfort. And that is the main engine that was built for the Titanic. Following completion of the hull and the main superstructure, the Titanic was launched May 31st, 1911. It then began the fitting out phase. As machinery was loaded onto the ship, the interior work began. After the Olympics maiden voyage, June 1911, slight changes were made to the Titanic's design. In early April, the Titanic underwent sea trials, and the ship was declared seaworthy. Okay, want to spend money? Single person berth, first class, cost between £30 and £870. Today, $5,400 American dollars, $162,000. $162,000 to get a first class place for a parlor suite and small private promenade deck. The average ticket for an adult second class passenger was £13, $23,053 today. The third class passengers, these were the immigrants. These are the ones who want to come over to the United States and Canada, paid £7, which today would be $1,267 for their ticket, depending on the place of origin. Ticket prices often include the price of rail travel to the 3 departure ports. Tickets for children, £3. Today, $543 if you want to bring a child. Nicknamed the Millionaire Special, the ship was captained by Edward J. Smith, who was known as the Millionaire's Captain because of his popularity with wealthy passengers. On board were a number of prominent people, including American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim, British journalist William Thomas Stead, and Macy's. How many of you went to Macy's when Macy's was a real store as opposed to be a part of the Federation today? Macy's department store co-owner Isidore Straus and his wife Ida. In addition, Ismay and Andrews were also traveling on the Titanic. Yeah. Titanic sinks, deck chairs on the Titanic. The voyage nearly began with a collision when the suction from the Titanic caused the dock, New York, to swing into the giant liner's path. After an hour of maneuvering to prevent the accident, the Titanic voyage was underway. The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Did you ever hear of the Unsinkable Molly Brown? There was a play about her, a movie about her. On the evening of April the 10th, the ship stopped at Cherbourg, France. The city's dock was too small to accommodate the Titanic, so passengers had to be ferried over and or ferried to from the ship in tenders. Tenders are those little boats that go no more than about 2 miles, 3 miles to get you to where you have to be. Among those boarding were John Jacob Astor and his pregnant wife, second wife, Madeline, and the unsinkable Molly Brown. On the morning of April 11th, the liner made its last scheduled stop in Europe at Queenstown, Cobb in Ireland. Approximately 1:30, the ship set sail for New York. I guess it was a short day. 1:30, this is what happens sometimes on cruise ships. You get into a port at 7 o'clock, you got to be back on the ship by 12:30, so they want to be out by 1:30 in this case. 2,200 people are on board, 1,300 of whom are passengers. Throughout much of the voyage, the wireless radio operators on the Titanic, guys named Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had been receiving iceberg warnings most of which were passed to the bridge. The two men worked for the Marconi Company, and much of their job was relaying passenger messages. That is the captain, John Edward Smith. On the evening of April 14th, the Titanic began to approach an area known to have icebergs. Captain Smith slightly altered the ship's course to head farther south. However, he maintained the ship's speed at 22 knots, 25 miles an hour. That's where the ship goes today. They have not increased the speed of ships. They're still about 25 miles at top speed. At 9:40 that evening, the Mesaba, the ship, sent a warning of an ice field. The message was never relayed to Titanic's bridge. One mistake. The ice warning, here it is, sent to those guys sitting there on the wireless. They were told, ice field ahead. At 10:55, the nearby Leland, California, line of California sent word that it had been stopped because it was surrounded by ice. Jack Phillips, who was handling passenger messages, scolded California for interrupting him. Hey, you got ice out there. Get out of here. I don't want to hear about it. I got other things to do. That's what happened. Two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were stationed in the Crow's Nest. Their task was made difficult by the fact that the ocean was unusually calm that night. Because there would be little water breaking at its base, an iceberg would be much more difficult to spot. In addition, who forgot the binoculars? You need binoculars. To this day, even with all of that equipment they have, the sonar, the radar, everything else, because I've been up at the bridge, I'll tell you about the bridge in a minute. You need they have a guy just with the binoculars looking out. They didn't have binoculars. Well, you know, they almost get into a crash as they leave, or an accident as they leave. They get here, they're ignoring iceberg warnings, and there are no binoculars. That is St. John's. Well, I'll show you right here. This is Newfoundland. Been to St. Anthony's, I've been to St. John's. So somewhere around here are the icebergs, because here is Nova Scotia. Somewhere in that area, the icebergs are. At approximately 11:40, about 450 miles south of Newfoundland, an iceberg was sighted. And the bridge was notified. The first officer, William Murdoch, ordered the ship hard a starboard, a maneuver that under the order system would in place would turn the ship to the port, to the left, and the engines would be reversed. The Titanic began to turn, but it was too close to avoid a collision. The ship's starboard, right side, scraped along the iceberg. At least 5 of its supposedly watertight components toward the bow were ruptured. Those are little icebergs. That's going into Newfoundland, yeah, and that's where they would have gone. That is about 5 o'clock in the morning when I was on the ship, and I took these pictures. And you really can't see them because it's late in the year. It's August. April, you would see them a lot better. But these icebergs constantly are flowing that way, and they should have known better, but they didn't. After assessing the damage, Andrews determined that as the ship's forward compartments were filled with water, its bow would probably drop deeper into the ocean, causing water from the ruptured components to spill over into each succeeding component. It's over. He knows it's over. Everybody, get to the lifeboats. The ship is not going to make it. Smith ordered Phillips to begin sending distress signals, one of which reached the Carpathia at approximately 12:20 a.m. On the morning of April 15th, and the Cunard ship immediately headed toward the stricken liner. However, it's 66 miles away, which means the best it could do was not get there for at least 2.5 hours, or 3 hours. So that's a problem. The Titanic was thought to be unsinkable, and so the passengers on board initially did nothing. Many passengers retired for the night. They were in their cabins, while those still awake carried on with their activities. The third class were particularly kept uninformed. Hey, they're the lowlives here. They just barely paid to get on. Many of the passengers and crew would not have even known or thought about the lifeboat capacities. There weren't enough lifeboats for the amount of passengers on the Titanic. Now this is a modern bridge, and this is me up outside of Quebec City with the captain of that particular ship, which was Celebrity. And I was up there because I had to do some narration of leaving Quebec City, and this is what you're seeing, and that's what you're seeing, and all that. But I was up at the modern bridge, and the modern bridge has everything modern, of course, computers, everything else, but they still have a guy like that with the binoculars. And that's what they do with the binoculars. They are looking out to see if there are any hazards, and they have binoculars. So anyway, that is me up on deck of a cruise ship. Other ships also responded, including the Olympic, but they're all too far away. A vessel was spotted nearby, but the Titanic could not contact it. The Californian was also in vicinity, but they shut everything off. The wireless is gone. They just shut it off for the night. Well, that's it. There's nothing out there that can help. As attempts were made to contact nearby vessels, the lifeboats began to be launched. Women and children first. Although the Titanic's number of lifeboats exceeded that required of the British Board of Trade, its 20 boats could carry only 1,178 people. There are 2,200 people on the ship. The ship is doomed, absolutely doomed. The problem exacerbated by lifeboats being launched well below capacity because crewmen worried that the davits would not be able to support the weight of a fully loaded boat. The Titanic had canceled its scheduled lifeboat drill earlier that day, and the crew was unaware that the davits had passed or been tested in Belfast. When you get on the cruise ship these days, you have to go through a muster drill. They tell you everything that is going on. And the crew every day goes through a assorted amount of drills, whether it's a fire, whether they hit something, whatever. They go through these drills. It's a working ship. None of this happened on the Titanic. Lifeboat number 7 was the first to leave the Titanic. It brought 27 people off, even though it held space for 65 others. In the end, only 705 of the 2,200 ended up in lifeboats. That guy on the right is a ship musician. He is Don Alexander. He's a piano player, but he's a ship musician. And they are part of the crew. And they go through all kind of training to help people in the event something's sinking. They have to be there, put them into auditoriums, put them into muster areas, lead them around. They don't put people on the lifeboats. They lead people to the lifeboats. That's what goes on today. Anyway, there's Don, my friend Don, who was a piano player in Holland, America. As the passengers waited to enter lifeboats, they were entertained by the Titanic musicians, who initially played in the first-class lounge before eventually moving to the ship's deck. Sources differ on how long they performed. Some reported that it was until shortly before the ship sank. Speculation also surrounded the last song they performed, likely either Autumn or Nearer My God to Thee. None of the musicians survived the sinking. Every man for himself. Just after 2 a.m., Captain Smith went into the wireless room and relieved the 2 wireless operators, saying, "Men, you have done your duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin. It's now every man for himself. You look out for yourselves. I release you." That's the way it kind of is at this time. I mean, every man for himself. At 2:20 a.m., the ship was gone, and so was Captain Smith. Hundreds of passengers and crews went into the icy water. Remember how north you are, and it's still April, but you're pretty far north, into the icy water, fearful of being swamped. Those in the lifeboats delayed returning to pick up survivors. By the time they rowed back, all the people in the water had died from exposure. In the end, 1,500 people perished. Aside from the crew, which lost 700, third-class passengers suffered the greatest number of losses. Of the 710, only 154 survived. Many of the era's wealthiest and most prominent families lost members, including Isidore and Ida Strauss from Macy's, John Jacob Astor. In popular mind, the glamour associated with the ship, its maiden voyage, and notable passengers magnified the tragedy of its sinking. Every man for himself, and there are the tenders. Today's tenders have engines, but they had to row them out. It's a daunting task. Legends almost arose immediately about the night's event, those who died and those who survived. Heroes and heroines such as the American Molly Brown, who helped command a lifeboat, and Captain Arthur Henry Rostrom of the Carpathia were identified, celebrated by the press. Others, notably Ismay, who found space in the lifeboat and survived, were vilified. People demanded answers. There was a strong desire to know, how did this happen? And inquiries into the sinking were held in the United States and Britain. It's my old Grundig radio. It was manufactured in 1951. As far as I know, it still works, as far as I know. It has electric cord going in, but also has tubes. Where if a tube blows, can I replace that tube in that 73-year-old radio? Probably not. Or I'd have to find somebody who all of a sudden has all these tubes. Maybe. That's got a shortwave radio on it. AM radio, FM shortwave. I used to listen to Radio Bulgaria on that radio. Halifax, Nova Scotia. United States Radio was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia on April 14th because David Sarnoff was in the right place at the right time. He managed the Marconi wireless station at Wanamaker's department store in New York. How many of you remember Wanamaker's?
I do.
Yeah, did you go to Manhattan or Yonkers?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Well, they were big in Philadelphia, too. Philadelphia and southern New Jersey, correct? Yeah. Anyway, that evening, the Titanic hits an iceberg not far from Halifax and sinks. And this guy begins to think about the possibilities of radio. Immediately after, the ship began transmitting distress signals. Soon the airwaves flooded with the news of the disaster as operators tracked the rescue effort. Sarnoff went to the stations, was at the Wanamaker station, oversaw a crew of telegraphers over the next few days. They published the names of the survivors of the Titanic tragedy. After 3 days at his Wanamaker post, he traveled to the Marconi Seagate station, Coney Island, Brooklyn, contacted the steamship Carpathia, which picked up survivors from the Titanic, and was returning to New York. Sarnoff proceeded to compile the names of these passengers and forwarded the news to their families. Sarnoff began to realize that somehow radio could be used with voice to reach a mass audience. The United States Senate held hearings. They wanted to know what happened. What happened? The U.S. investigation lasted from April 19th to May 25th, led by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan. 80 people were interviewed. Notable witnesses included Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the most senior officer to survive. Lightoller was the most senior officer to survive, and he defended the actions of his superiors, including Captain Smith's refusal to decrease the ship's speed. Many passengers testified to the general confusion on the ship. General warning never sounded. One night I was on a cruise ship. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. All the bells and whistles go off. Captain says there's a fire on deck 11. Just be aware, it seems to be no danger. We have to tell you. And they did, and then a half hour later after the fire was put out, he said you could all go back to sleep now. Causing a number of passengers and crew members to be unaware of the danger for some time. In addition, because a scheduled lifeboat drill was not held, it's part of the muster drill, the lowering of the boats was often haphazard. The commander is dead. E.G. Smith, in memoriam. The officers, crew, and passengers. 1635 ill-fated liner, the Titanic. and it hits an iceberg. That was one of the initial posters put out on that. And some of it's correct and some of it's incorrect. The United States Senate hearings, U.S. Investigation faulted the British Board of Trade, to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality. Other contributing factors included the failure of Captain Smith to slow down the Titanic after receiving warnings. This is one of the headlines, 1,340 people perish, 86, mostly women and children rescued. That was the very, very early tabulation, the New York Tribune. In May, the British inquiry began. It was overseen by the British Board of Trade, the same agency that had been derided by U.S. investigators for insufficient lifeboat requirements. Presiding judge was Sir Charles Bingham, Lord Mercy. Little new evidence was discovered during the 28 days of testimony. Final report stated the loss of life, or the loss of the said ship, was due to a collision with an iceberg brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was being navigated. So how many of you have been out to New Mexico? How many of you have been out to Arizona? Nobody? Nobody's been to Phoenix? Nobody's been to Santa Fe? Well, the New Mexico Territory is no more. The territory of New Mexico is an organized, incorporated territory of the United States that existed from September 9th, 1850 until January 6th, when it was admitted to the Union as the state of New Mexico, making it the longest-lived, organized, incorporated territory of the United States, lasting approximately 62 years. Though people in Puerto Rico who would argue about that, because Puerto Rico has been a territory of the United States since 1898, which was 126 years ago. Camelback Mountain in Phoenix. The Arizona Organic Act was an organic act passed by the 37th U.S. Congress on March 12, 1862, by Representative James M. Ashley of Ohio. The act provided for the creation of the Arizona Territory by the division of the New Mexico Territory into two territories along the current boundary between New Mexico and Arizona. Arizona became a state on April 14. There are all kinds of problems in the Balkans. All kinds of problems. Been going on and on and on for decades and decades and decades. And this is the first Balkan War. On December 3rd, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro were ready to sign an armistice with Turkey, ending the fighting in the First Balkan War. During the two-month conflict, a military coalition between Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, known as the Balkan League, expelled Turkey and all other Ottoman Empire's former European possessions, with the exception of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. And you might remember the novelty song called Constantinople, where the Turks gave it the works, and why they named it. Well, it was about 70 years ago. It's a cute little novelty song. If I played it, you would remember it. That did not end the hostilities. 1910 fight. Racism, censorship. Well, I don't know how much you know about censorship in the 19-teens, but a lot of the movie censorship had to do with boxing, believe it or not. A lot of it. 1910 fight, racism, and censorship. After heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson's 1910 victory over James J. Jeffries, the Great White Hope, anti-black, anti-boxing crusaders blocked local screenings of a film that showed the match. It was $20 for a ringside seat. That would cost $660 today, which would be a bargain considering what ringside seats go for, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. Jeffries came out of retirement to challenge Johnson. He had to lose 100 pounds to get to fighting weight. The fight of the century took place on the 4th of July, 1910, 114 years ago, in front of 20,000 people at a ring built just for the occasion in downtown Reno. Johnson beat Jeffries in the 15th round. Jeffries, who boasted that he had never been knocked out in a fight, fell 3 times to Johnson's punches and was being counted out when his manager called the fight. fight was filmed. That becomes a major, major problem. You figure, well, what's the big deal? Fight's filmed. Becomes a big problem. That's Reno, Nevada, which builds itself as the biggest little city in the world where the fight took place. The outcome of the fight triggered race riots that evening all across the United States on the 4th of July. From Texas and Colorado to New York and Washington, D.C., Johnson's victory over Jeffries dashed white dreams of finding a great white hope to defeat him. Many whites felt humiliated by the defeat of Jeffries. Blacks, on the other hand, were jubilant, celebrated Johnson's great victory and the victory for racial advancement. But this is a fight. Mind you, this is just a fight, but it is 1910. Riots erupted in New York, Baltimore, Pittsburgh. Actually, Pittsburgh didn't have the H then. Pittsburgh didn't have an H between 1891 and 1911 because some federal bureaucracy said the way you spelled Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G. There was no H. Then somebody found a document saying, no, it is Pittsburgh. And they changed the spelling back, 1911. Philadelphia, New Orleans, Atlanta, St. Louis, Little Rock, and Houston. Riots occurred in 25 states, 50 cities. At least 20 people were killed. 20 people were killed over a boxing match. Across the U.S. from the riots, hundreds more were injured. The fight, racism and censorship. The fight promoter, George Tex Rickard, who eventually built the third Madison Square Garden in New York, also refereed the bout, and he sold the fight films. The film was recorded by 9 cameramen and is 2 hours long. The Jeffries-Johnson World Championship Boxing Contest film, released the year of the fight, received more public attention in the United States than any other film that was ever made to date. Many states and cities banned the exhibition of the film. The movement to censor Johnson's victory took over the country with 3 days after the fight. And then there's another fight. This one is in 1912, and it's 45 rounds. They used to have 45-round fights in those days. Jim Flynn, who's a sheriff, who's known as Sheriff Jim Flynn, and Jack Johnson. And he was called, rather, he's a fireman. The fighting fireman challenges Johnson. On July 4th, again, July 4th, 1912, 112 years ago today, the other day, Johnson next defended his title against fireman Jim Flynn in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Las Vegas, New Mexico. In a 45-round fight. Despite being warned by the referee, Flynn continually attempted to headbutt Johnson, and the local sheriff eventually stepped in at the 9th round to stop the fight, giving the fight to Johnson. $5 ringside seat would cost $165 today. The fight was filmed. Producers had hoped to successfully distribute it, just as the Jeffries fight was distributed. Aware of the riots from 1910, Southern congressmen introduced a bill that would outlaw the interstate transportation of fight films. This is Congress. It's 1910. 12. Representative Seaborn Roddenberry of Georgia referred to Johnson specifically as an African bite beast and stated no man descended from the old Saxon race can look upon that kind of contest without abhorrence and disgust. The Southern racists didn't want a film of an African American beating a white man shown anywhere. This is the Congressman Fettus Sims, and he's from Tennessee. On July 31st, citing the same motion picture, Congress passed the Sims Act, which banned the transport of fight films over state lines. The law permitted prize fights to be filmed, but they could not be distributed across state lines. A community hosting a prize fight could see the films, but they would also have to deal with the consequences as a result of its showing. The act was the first time Congress took censorship actions in regards to movie and films. It was also the beginning of the politics of sports business. Feds finally get Jack Johnson. They've been after him. He's been a world heavyweight champion too long. He's beating everybody. And the feds, particularly the Congress, want to get it. They get it, finally. Why? Because of that woman. Jack Johnson was ensnared by the Mann Act, also known as the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. The law was invoked over and over again to punish black men for their relationships with women. Now let me explain what this is, because I violated the Mann Act. I will tell you that. When I was a teenager, I was living in New York, and my girlfriend was in New Jersey. And we'll just leave it at that, okay? Lots of people have violated the Mann Act. And it's still on the books. It has not been taken off the books. And I can tell you right now, I believe that 3/4 of the men walking around the United States have violated the Mann Act. It's a stupid law, but this is what it's about. Rooted in fears of women's growing mobility and racist characterization of the sexual appetites of non-white people, the law was designed to protect women against the supposed scourge of white slavery, a term used to refer to sex trafficking in the early 20th century, maybe even the 21st century. Look up Jeffrey Epstein. On October 11th, F. Cameron Falconet came to Chicago accusing Johnson of kidnapping her daughter, Lucille Cameron. On October 18th, Johnson was arrested by Chicago police on state kidnapping charges. U.S. District Attorney James H. Wilkerson began building a federal Mann case despite cautions from Attorney General George W. Wickensham. Lucille Cameron was not cooperating with investigators, and she is brought before the grand jury. Johnson and his girlfriend. The Mann case fell apart because it became clear that Cameron had been a prostitute before she left Milwaukee and had been in Chicago for more than 3 months before she first met Johnson. On December 4th, Johnson and Cameron were married. Federal government would get other testimony and railroad Johnson. In 1913, Johnson was found guilty of violating the Mann Act, sentenced to prison for 1 year and a day. Johnson fled the country. You ain't seen nothing yet. Mammy. There's Jolson. And Jolson becomes a star. You know, Jolson started as a comedian in vaudeville. That's how he started out. He and his brother had a comedic act. And if you listen to old-time radio shows, which I do, because I love the old Jack Benny shows, even Jolson show and all that, I do listen to it because I have one of these that allows me to listen to old-time radio shows that are stored. Anyway, he had great comedic timing. He was really good as a comedian, particularly on his shows with Jack Benny. On March 2nd, the New York Times published an article about a new play about to open at the Winter Garden Theater, which is still there. It was 2 plays in one. The production was called World of Society and A Night with the Peruts. Stellar Mayhew was the star. Al Jolson was a cast member when the play opened. But within about 10 days, Al Jolson was a superstar. And there is the program for that. And he is all of a sudden the main guy on the cover with his name on the cover. In World of Society, Jolson introduced a character called Gus that he performed in blackface. It was a hit which propelled Jolson into the rarefied air of a Broadway star. Jolson got top billing. The blackface still haunts the Jolson legacy to this day. But he was not the only one who performed in blackface. Sophie Tucker performed in black. You heard of Sophie Tucker here? How many of you hadn't heard of Sophie Tucker? Sophie Tucker, less the Red Hot Mamas. She was kind of a singer. She was kind of an actress, kind of a comedian. Because she was an overweight woman, they put her in blackface because they didn't think an overweight white woman could sell. That was 1908. He wasn't the only one. Fred Astaire was in blackface in a movie in the 1930s, and so many others. He was not the only one. He turned to performing in blackface around 1904 to save his performing career. Blackface was a holdover from the minstrel shows of the 19th century. W.C. Handy, St. Louis Blues. Heard of that, St. Louis Blues? Well, it wasn't the St. Louis Blues in 1912. It was different blues. William Christopher W.C. Handy became interested in music at an early age. Handy eventually began writing songs describing hardships he experienced. In September, he published Memphis Blues, now considered the first blues song. Subtitled Mr. Crump, the Memphis Blues is said to be based on a campaign song written by Handy for Edward Crump, a candidate for mayor of Memphis, Tennessee. Handy claimed writing Mr. Crump, but Memphis musicians said it was written by Handy's clarinetist, Paul Wyer. Billy Strayhorn wrote a lot of Duke Ellington's music. He couldn't sell it under the name of Billy Strayhorn. Duke Ellington could sell the music. A lot of it was written by Billy Strayhorn. Jim Thorpe in the Olympics. The Olympics starting, of course, in a couple of weeks, July 26 from Paris. A member of the Sac and Fox Nation, Jim Thorpe was the first Native American to win a gold medal for the United States in the Olympics. Considered one of the most versatile athletes in modern sports, he won 2 Olympic gold medals in the 1912 Stockholm, Sweden Summer Games. But there was a problem. Thorpe played baseball for the Rocky Mount Club in North Carolina in 1909 and 1910. He got paid. And if you were a true Olympian, you could not take money. You were supposed to be an amateur. When a report appeared in the Worcester Telegram and Gazette stating as much, it was deemed that Thorpe had infringed the United States Olympic Committee rules regarding amateurism. He was a pro, should never have been in the event. Shortly after the games, he was stripped of his medals. Oh, Tarzan. How many of you like Tarzan? How many of you like Carol Burnett doing Tarzan? Remember she used to do the Tarzan yell on her show? Carol Burnett. Tarzan of the Apes makes its first appearance in 1912. It was written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the first in the Tarzan series. The story was first printed in the pulp magazine, the All Story, in October. All Story published it in its entirety in installments. Anybody want an Oreo cookie now? Anybody want an Oreo cookie? Yes, no? How many of you want an Oreo cookie? You do. She's the only one that admits she wants. Do you eat them by pulling apart the cookie and then scraping off the frosting? How many of you have done that? Tear apart the cookie and then just scrape off the frosting. I still do it. Am I the only one? Am I the only one? Anyway, as exquisite in taste as in appearance, the National Biscuit Company, the Oreo cookie. On March 6, Oreos were developed and produced by Nabisco in New York City. The very first Oreos were sold to a grocer in Hoboken, New Jersey, named S.C. Thusen in March of 1912. 9 1/4 pounds of Oreos cost the store $1.85, which means 9 1/4 pounds, if they wanted to buy it to sell, would cost $60 today. And the tin they came in, that was another 50 cents that you had to pay for it. Slightly more than $16 today. This was not a cheap cookie. Girl Scouts of America. How many of you had girls who were in the Girl Scouts? 1, 2, you had. How many of you had to sell Girl Scout cookies? You had to sell Girl Scout cookies. Juliette Gordon Low was the American founder of the Girl Scouts of USA. She was inspired by the work of Lord Baden-Powell, founder of the Scout movement. She joined the Girl Guide movement in England, forming her own group of Girl Guides there in 1911. 1912, she returned to the States and established the first United States Girl Guide troop in Savannah, Georgia on March 12th. Well, what can we say about 1912? Woodrow Wilson. After the October 2nd, 1919 stroke, Woodrow Wilson was a near invalid. 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on February 10th, 1967. It established and explained a complete order of presidential succession as well as contingency plans to fill any executive vacancies that came after, started talked about after Wilson had a stroke. What is his legacy? It's not good. It is not good. Remove Woodrow Wilson's name from New Brunswick Public School now. His legacy is at best mixed. He did lead the country during World War I, was instrumental in crafting the League of Nations. He also trampled on the rights of those who protested World War I by jailing them, including Eugene V. Debs, his opponent in 1912 in the presidential election. He was a racist. He possessed a sympathy for the lost cause narrative. In 1913, Wilson gave his newly appointed cabinet the permission to segregate their departments. The KKK had a revival during his term. At Princeton University on June 27, 2020, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs was changed to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and Wilson College was renamed First College. On January 26, 2022, Camden, New Jersey's Woodrow Wilson High School got a new name, Eastside High School. Wilson did appoint his close friend, the Justice Louis Brandeis, to the Supreme Court, first Jewish American to sit on the nation's highest court. Wilson's agenda, which passed Congress at the end of 1930, included tariff, banking, and labor reforms, and introduced the income tax. Wilson also expanded the executive branch with the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Internal Revenue Service. They all have to pay income tax, but it wasn't because of Wilson, it was because of a constitutional amendment. Wilson embraced and encouraged new technology. He started airmail service and endorsed the creation of an interstate highway. The Titanic. Celine Dion sung a song about the Titanic. That's when they allowed Titanic songs back on the ships, because of Celine Dion. Within a month of the Titanic's demise, Saved from the Titanic was released in America. The short silent film told the story of actress Dorothy Gibson, starred in the film, and her escape from the disaster. Atlantic, a British talking movie, came out in 1929. It told the story of the Titanic, but did not use the name of the ship for legal reasons. The 1997 Titanic was the most expensive film ever made at the time, nominated for 11 Oscars at the 70th Annual Academy Awards. Celine Dion's song, My Heart Will Go On, won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Celine Dion recorded the theme song for the film, titled My Heart Will Go On, in February 1999. And My Heart Will Go On won the Grammy for the Song of the Year. In the months following the sinking, ice patrols on the North Atlantic Ocean became more frequent, rigorous. Stricter rules regarding onboard radios were introduced, requiring crews to man them at all times. Muster and lifeboat safety drills were made mandatory. 1914, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was created, replacing a patchwork of national conventions with one global maritime safety standard. That is an iceberg. That is an iceberg that is floating off of Newfoundland. That's an iceberg. It took, in 1985, it took Robert Ballard 8 days to find the Titanic, 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. For more than 70 years, the location of the liner's wreckage, about 12,600 feet below the ocean surface, had been a mystery. NBC Radio, that came out of the Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic brought radio into the public spotlight and prompted the U.S. Congress to regulate the medium for the first time. Sarnoff, David Sarnoff, would refer to this incident as the most important turning point in his career. The Titanic disaster brought radio to the front and incidentally made Sarnoff started NBC Radio in 1926. Commercial radio in Canada started in 1919. The Second Balkan War broke out when Bulgaria, dissatisfied with its share of the spoils in the First Balkan War, attacked its former allies, Serbia and Greece, in June 1913. Serbian and Greek armies repulsed the Bulgarian offensive and counterattacked, entering Bulgaria. It would plant the seeds for World War I. Although it was a hit, W.C. Handy got very little money for Memphis Blues, so he set up Handy Brothers Music Company. In 1914, published his St. Louis Blues. The song was a bigger hit than Memphis Blues, and this time he received more of the profits. Other songs by Handy included Yellow Dog Blues and Beale Street Blues. Jack Johnson, Donald Trump pardoned him. May 24th, 2018. He was convicted of violating the Mann Act in 1913, taking his white girlfriend across state lines. Johnson surrendered to U.S. authorities in the 1920s, 10 months in prison. His story was the focus of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Broadway play The Great White Hope, starring James Earl Jones in 1969. A 2006 book, Unforgivable Blackness, The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson, was turned into a PBS special. There's Jolie. He was the first bona fide superstar of the 19 teens into the 20s, billed as the world's greatest entertainer. 1927, talkie film starred Jolson. The jazz singer opened the doors for other talkies and began the process of silencing silent movies. Jolson appeared in blackface, which was common in vaudeville at the time. Because of that, Jolson's legacy is staying. Yet, Jolson championed civil rights and pushed for blacks, people like Cab Calloway, to be treated better in Hollywood. Tarzan remains relevant in culture. There are movies, radio series, television shows, Tarzan video games, and comic books. The Oreo sandwich was the best-selling cookie of the 20th century. National Girl Scout Cookie Weekend is an annual event in the United States. It's estimated the Girl Scouts sell more than 2 million cookies annually, with monies going to various organizations. How many cookies did you have to sell? Lots. And they were sat in your house, right? Sat in your house. If you couldn't sell it, did you give it back? No, you ate it.
No,
You
we
ate
paid
it.
for them.
Yeah, you paid for it. There are about 1.7 million members of the Girl Scouts today. Any questions? Any comments? It is your turn. Anybody?